What's the scariest coincidence that made you realize it wasn't a coincidence at all? The barista handed me my coffee at the airport Starbucks in Nashville, and I heard someone behind me order the exact same drink with the exact same modifications I always get. Grande Americano, extra shot, room for cream, no water. I turned around and saw my girlfriend Rebecca standing there, smiling like she'd just won a surprise party. The problem was, I hadn't told her I was flying to Nashville. I hadn't told anyone except my business partner Derek, and that conversation had happened in my locked office 3 hours before my flight. Rebecca kissed me on the cheek and said what an amazing coincidence this was, that she'd decided last minute to visit her college roommate who lived here, and wasn't it crazy that we'd booked the same flight? My stomach felt strange as I smiled back, because I'd been with Rebecca for 7 months and she'd never once mentioned having a college roommate in Nashville. I'd met Rebecca in January at a networking event in Portland, one of those tedious cocktail hours where everyone pretends to care about synergy and disruption while really just looking for their next opportunity. I was there representing my software security company, DataShield, which I'd founded 5 years earlier with Derek Emerson, and Rebecca was attending as a freelance marketing consultant. She'd approached me at the bar with a comment about my presentation on data privacy, and we'd talked for 2 hours about encryption protocols and the ethics of user data collection, topics that most people found boring, but that she seemed genuinely interested in. She was smart and funny and had this way of tilting her head when she listened that made you feel like you were the most fascinating person in the room. We exchanged numbers, went on our first date 3 days later, and had been together ever since. The Nashville coincidence happened in April, and it was the first time something felt actively wrong rather than just lucky. Rebecca and I had been doing the long-distance thing since she lived in Seattle, and I was based in Portland, seeing each other most weekends and talking every night. She knew my general work schedule but not the specifics of my travel, or at least I'd never given her details beyond mentioning I traveled for client meetings occasionally. This Nashville trip was supposed to be confidential, a meeting with a potential client who was considering switching from our competitor and wanted to keep the conversation quiet until they'd made a decision. Derek and I had been careful about communications, using encrypted channels and not discussing the meeting outside our locked office. So seeing Rebecca at that airport Starbucks, ordering my exact drink before I'd even noticed she was there, made my skin prickle with something I couldn't quite name yet. On the flight, Rebecca sat 3 rows behind me. She said she'd booked last minute and couldn't get a seat near mine, and I spent the entire 2 hours trying to rationalize the coincidence. Seattle to Nashville wasn't an unusual route, and maybe she really did have a college friend here that she'd never mentioned. People had friends they didn't talk about all the time, right? And the drink order was probably just because she'd heard me order it so many times that she'd started liking it herself. I told myself I was being paranoid, that 7 months of a good relationship was making me look for problems where none existed because I was scared of being happy. My ex-wife Lauren had left me 3 years ago after catching me working too much and caring too little about our marriage, and I'd been gun-shy about serious relationships ever since. Maybe I was self-sabotaging by imagining conspiracies where there were just normal coincidences. But then Rebecca texted me the name of her hotel, the Omni downtown, and I felt that stomach drop sensation again because I was staying at the Omni too. I hadn't mentioned my hotel to anyone except Derek, and I'd booked it under DataShield's corporate account, not my personal name. I texted back asking if she wanted to grab dinner, and she suggested a restaurant called Husk that she said her roommate had recommended. I agreed and spent the rest of the day in my client meeting trying to focus on encryption architecture while my brain kept circling back to the coincidences piling up. That evening at Husk, Rebecca was already seated when I arrived even though I was 5 minutes early, and she knew to order me a bourbon even though I usually drank wine with dinner. When I asked how she knew I wanted bourbon, she laughed and said I'd mentioned loving bourbon once, months ago, and she just remembered. I didn't remember mentioning it. The Nashville trip ended with Rebecca and I flying home on different flights. Hers left 4 hours before mine, and I spent those 4 hours in the airport searching through my phone and laptop for mentions of bourbon or Nashville or the Omni Hotel in any conversations we'd had. I found nothing. I checked my email sent folder and my text history and even my social media direct messages, looking for any place where I might have shared information about this trip that I'd forgotten about. Still nothing. I opened my calendar app and realized with a cold feeling spreading through my chest that my Nashville meeting had been added to my calendar with all the details including hotel and flight information, and my calendar was synced to the cloud through a service called Calendar Share that I'd set up years ago and mostly forgotten about. I checked the sharing settings and saw that someone with the email address, email protected, had view access to my calendar and had been granted that access 7 months ago, right around when I'd met Rebecca. I called Derek from the airport before my flight, walking to a quiet corner near a closed gate where no one could overhear me. I asked him if he'd ever heard me mention sharing my calendar with anyone, and he said no, that our calendars were only shared with each other for scheduling purposes. I described the calendar share situation, and Derek went quiet for a long moment before asking if I thought Rebecca had accessed my calendar somehow. I told him I didn't know, that it could be a coincidence that someone with her name had access and that email address could belong to anyone, but even as I said it, I knew how weak it sounded. Derek suggested I change all my passwords immediately and revoke that calendar access, and I did both things while sitting at the gate, watching the access log to see when RJ Marketing had last viewed my calendar. The log showed access attempts almost daily, most recently that morning at 6:15 a.m. Pacific Time, which was 8:15 a.m. in Nashville, right around when I'd been getting coffee at that Starbucks. I didn't confront Rebecca about the calendar when I got home, mostly because I wanted to watch and see if there were more coincidences I'd been missing. I spent the next 2 weeks being hyper-aware of everything I told her and everything I kept to myself, creating a mental map of what information I was controlling. I mentioned casually that I was thinking about getting a gym membership at a place called PowerFit near my office, and 3 days later Rebecca posted an Instagram photo from PowerFit with a caption about trying a new gym. I told Derek in our office, doors closed, windows covered, that I was considering buying a specific model of mountain bike, a Trek Excalibur that I'd been researching online. And the next weekend, Rebecca sent me a link to an article about that exact bike model saying she'd randomly come across it and thought of me. Each coincidence was small enough to rationalize individually, but together they formed a pattern that made my hands shake when I thought about it too hard. I called my younger brother Julian in early May, and we met for coffee at a place Rebecca had never been to, a small shop on the east side of Portland that I'd chosen specifically because it was off my usual route. Julian worked in IT security, specializing in digital forensics for law firms, and I trusted him completely. I explained the situation without using Rebecca's name at first, framing it as a hypothetical about someone having unauthorized access to my devices and accounts. Julian listened with the focused intensity he brought to technical problems, asking specific questions about my security setup and what kind of access this person would need to know the things they seemed to know. When I finally admitted it was my girlfriend and showed him the calendar share access log, Julian's expression shifted from analytical to concerned, and he said this wasn't just casual snooping, but a deliberate surveillance operation. Julian explained that for someone to have the kind of information Rebecca seemed to have, she'd need more than just calendar access. She'd likely installed monitoring software on my phone or laptop, or she had access to my email and was reading my messages, or she'd somehow compromised my cloud storage accounts where I kept work documents and personal files. He asked if Rebecca had ever had physical access to my devices unsupervised, and I realized with a sinking feeling that she'd had plenty of opportunities. She'd stayed at my apartment probably 20 times over 7 months, and I'd often left my laptop and phone charging in the living room while I showered or slept or cooked dinner. Julian said he could do a forensic analysis of my devices to check for monitoring software, but that I should be prepared for what we might find, that this level of surveillance suggested something more than just a nosy girlfriend. We scheduled the forensic analysis for the following Saturday at Julian's apartment, and I brought both my work laptop and my personal phone, telling Rebecca I was visiting Julian for a family thing and would be out of touch most of the day. Julian set up his analysis equipment, specialized software that could detect hidden processes and unauthorized applications, and started scanning my devices while I sat on his couch drinking terrible coffee and trying not to think about what 7 months of trust might have been built on. The phone scan finished first, and Julian called me over to his workstation with an expression that told me he'd found something. He showed me a process running in the background of my phone that shouldn't have been there, a monitoring application disguised as a system update that was capturing my location, my text messages, my phone calls, and my app usage, and uploading everything to a remote server every 6 hours. The laptop scan revealed similar software, a keylogger that recorded every keystroke I made, and a screen capture program that took screenshots every 30 seconds whenever I was active. Both programs had been installed 7 months ago, within 2 weeks of when I'd first met Rebecca, and both were sending data to the same remote server using an encrypted connection that Julian said would be difficult to trace without law enforcement resources. I felt something like vertigo looking at the evidence on Julian's screen, seeing the proof that someone had been watching everything I did for 7 months, reading every email I sent, seeing every website I visited, tracking every place I went. Julian asked if I wanted to remove the software immediately, and I surprised myself by saying no, that I wanted to leave it running so Rebecca wouldn't know I'd discovered it, that I needed to figure out what she was doing with this information before I confronted her. Julian looked at me like I was crazy but agreed to help, and we spent the rest of that Saturday mapping out a strategy. First, we'd document everything about the monitoring software, when it was installed, what it was capturing, where it was sending data, creating a forensic record that could be used as evidence later. Second, we'd set up a separate secure device that I'd use for any communications I wanted to keep private, a burner phone and a laptop that Rebecca had never seen. Third, we'd start investigating Rebecca herself, looking for information about who she really was and why she was surveilling me. Julian suggested we hire a private investigator, someone with resources to do background checks and financial research, and I agreed even though the thought of paying someone to investigate my girlfriend made me feel sick. The private investigator was named Dennis Kwan, a former police detective who now ran a small firm specializing in corporate investigations and infidelity cases. I met him at his office in downtown Portland on Monday morning, and I brought printouts of everything Julian had found along with a timeline of Rebecca's coincidences. Dennis listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather notebook, and when I finished, he said this sounded less like a girlfriend being nosy and more like corporate espionage or some kind of targeted intelligence operation. He asked what kind of clients DataShield worked with and whether I had access to sensitive information that competitors or foreign actors might want. And I explained that we handled security for financial institutions and healthcare companies, protecting data for millions of users. Dennis nodded and said that made me a valuable target, that someone with access to DataShield systems could potentially breach client data or steal proprietary technology. Dennis quoted me $5,000 for a comprehensive background investigation on Rebecca, including employment verification, financial history, social media analysis, and surveillance if needed. I wrote him a check from my personal account and gave him everything I knew about Rebecca: her full name, Rebecca Jane Holloway, her birth date, her Seattle address, her phone number, her social media profiles, the name of her supposed marketing consulting business. Dennis said he'd have preliminary results within a week and would call me on the secure burner phone Julian had set up. I left his office feeling like I was in a spy movie, using burner phones and hiring investigators and suspecting my girlfriend of corporate espionage, and I still wasn't sure if I was being appropriately cautious or completely paranoid. That week was surreal in the way I had to perform normalcy with Rebecca while knowing she was monitoring everything I did. We had dinner on Wednesday. I cooked salmon at my apartment while she sat at my kitchen island telling me about a client project, and I found myself analyzing every word she said for hidden meanings or slips that might reveal her real agenda. She mentioned casually that she'd been thinking about our future together, whether I'd ever consider moving to Seattle or if she should think about relocating to Portland. And I wondered if that was a genuine relationship question, or if she was probing for information about my long-term plans. I said I was open to discussing it, but wanted to wait until DataShield was in a more stable position, which was true but also deliberately vague, and I watched her reaction to see if she seemed disappointed or satisfied with my non-answer. Dennis called my burner phone on Friday afternoon while I was at the office, and I took the call in my car parked in the building's garage where I knew there were no security cameras pointed at that spot. Dennis said he'd found some interesting things about Rebecca Holloway, starting with the fact that her marketing consulting business, RJ Marketing Solutions, had no clients that he could verify, no business license filed with the state, and no tax returns showing business income for the past 3 years. Her Seattle address was real, but the apartment was rented under a different name, Claire Voss, who appeared to be Rebecca's roommate based on utility bills. Dennis had run background checks on both Rebecca Holloway and Claire Voss, and he'd found that they both had thin credit histories that only went back about 8 years, the kind of histories that suggested either very young adults or carefully constructed identities. More disturbing, Dennis had found social media photos showing Rebecca with a man she'd tagged as her brother. Except reverse image searches of those photos showed the same man tagged in other people's photos with different relationships, sometimes as a boyfriend, sometimes as a cousin, sometimes as a coworker. Dennis had identified the man as someone named Garrett Finch, who had a criminal record in California for fraud and identity theft from 6 years ago. Garrett had served 18 months in prison and had been released 3 years ago, right around the time Rebecca Holloway's credit history began. Dennis said he couldn't prove definitively that Rebecca and Garrett were working together, or that they were running some kind of scam, but the connections were suggestive enough that I should be very careful and should probably consider going to the police. I asked Dennis if he could surveil Rebecca, follow her for a few days to see where she went and who she met with, and he said he could do that, but it would cost additional money and wouldn't necessarily prove anything illegal was happening. I told him to do it anyway, that I needed to know the full scope of whatever was going on before I decided how to handle it. Dennis agreed and said he'd start surveillance on Monday, focusing on Rebecca's Seattle activities since that's where she supposedly lived and worked. I hung up and sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, trying to process the information Dennis had given me and trying to figure out what Rebecca's endgame could possibly be. If this was corporate espionage, who had hired her? If this was identity theft, what was she planning to steal? If this was something else entirely, what the hell was it? I called Derek on the burner phone and asked if he could meet me somewhere private, away from the office and away from anywhere Rebecca might expect me to be. We met at a hiking trailhead outside Portland on Saturday morning, and I briefed him on everything while we walked along a muddy path through cedar trees. Derek listened with increasing alarm, stopping to face me when I got to the part about Garrett Finch and the fraud conviction. He asked if I thought Rebecca was trying to steal DataShield's client data or proprietary code, and I said I didn't know, but that it was a possibility we had to consider. Derek pointed out that I had full administrative access to all our systems, that if Rebecca had all my passwords and keystrokes, she could potentially breach anything I could access. We needed to assume our security had been compromised, and we needed to act immediately to secure our systems and alert our clients. Derek wanted to go to the police right then, but I asked him to wait until Dennis finished his surveillance, until we had a complete picture of what Rebecca was doing. Derek argued that every day we waited was another day our client's data was potentially at risk. And I knew he was right, but I also knew that going to the police with the evidence we had, monitoring software and a girlfriend with a thin background, might not be enough to trigger a serious investigation. We needed more. We needed proof of what Rebecca was actually doing with the information she was stealing, proof of who she was working with or working for, proof of criminal intent beyond just having monitoring software on my devices. Derek reluctantly agreed to wait 1 week, and we spent the rest of that hike planning how to secure DataShield systems without tipping off Rebecca that I knew about her surveillance. The secure system implementation started on Monday morning with Derek and me coming in at 5 a.m. before anyone else arrived at the office. We created new administrative accounts with new passwords that I only typed on Derek's laptop, which had never been in Rebecca's presence. And we revoked access from my compromised account. We changed all our server passwords and encryption keys, documented everything in a secure file that lived on an air-gapped system, and then spent the day pretending everything was normal while actually working from Derek's credentials instead of mine. I kept using my compromised laptop for routine tasks, sending emails and browsing websites, maintaining the appearance that nothing had changed so Rebecca wouldn't realize her access had been cut off. Dennis called Wednesday afternoon with an update from his surveillance of Rebecca in Seattle. He'd followed her for 3 days, and she'd spent most of that time in a co-working space in Capitol Hill, sitting at a laptop for hours at a time. Dennis had used a telephoto lens to photograph her screen from across the street through the co-working space's window, and he'd captured images showing what looked like database queries and file directories that Dennis recognized from his police work as the kind of things you'd see when someone was attempting to access secure systems. More concerning, Dennis had photographed Rebecca meeting with Garrett Finch at a coffee shop, and their interaction looked professional rather than familial, with Rebecca showing Garrett something on her laptop and Garrett taking notes. Dennis had also followed Rebecca to a meeting at a downtown Seattle office building, where she'd spent 90 minutes in a suite occupied by a company called Helix Strategic Solutions. Dennis had researched Helix and found they were a boutique consulting firm that specialized in competitive intelligence and corporate research, the kind of company that touted legal investigation services, but that had been accused in industry publications of engaging in more questionable tactics. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made me feel cold. Rebecca was working for Helix. Helix had been hired by someone who wanted information about DataShield, and Rebecca had spent 7 months infiltrating my life to steal access to our systems and our client data. The question was, who had hired Helix, and what were they planning to do with what Rebecca had stolen? I met with Dennis in person on Thursday afternoon at his office, and we went through all the surveillance photos and documentation. Dennis had compiled a comprehensive report showing Rebecca's movements, her meetings with Garrett Finch, her time at Helix Strategic Solutions, and the screen captures of what looked like her attempting to access DataShield systems. Dennis said this was clearly corporate espionage and that I needed to report it to both the police and the FBI, that data breaches involving financial and healthcare clients were federal crimes that the FBI's cyber division took very seriously. He'd already drafted a formal complaint document and had organized all the evidence in a way that law enforcement could immediately use. He said I should also contact a lawyer who specialized in corporate security breaches, because DataShield would need legal representation when this became public. I called a law firm that specialized in cybersecurity law, recommended by Derek's brother who worked in the tech industry, and I got a consultation appointment for Friday morning with a partner named Victoria Lang. Victoria had 15 years of experience handling data breach cases and corporate espionage litigation, and when I walked her through the situation, she said this was one of the more sophisticated operations she'd seen. The level of planning, infiltrating my personal life, installing monitoring software, maintaining access for 7 months, suggested significant resources and motivation behind it. Victoria asked if DataShield had any competitors who might want our client list or our proprietary encryption algorithms, and I mentioned that our main competitor was a company called SecureNet Systems that had lost several major contracts to us in the past year. Victoria said we needed to move quickly on multiple fronts: file a police report documenting the monitoring software and the surveillance, notify the FBI about potential data breach and corporate espionage, send a preservation notice to Helix Strategic Solutions, demanding they preserve all records related to Rebecca and DataShield, and prepare for the possibility that we'd need to notify clients about a potential security incident. She explained that if Rebecca had accessed any client data, even if she hadn't exfiltrated it, we were legally obligated to report it to those clients and potentially to regulatory bodies depending on what kind of data was involved. The potential fallout was massive: damaged reputation, lost clients, regulatory investigations, civil lawsuits. Everything Derek and I had built over 5 years could collapse because I'd trusted the wrong person. I filed the police report Friday afternoon at the Portland Police Bureau's Central Precinct, meeting with Detective Adam Volkov, who worked in the high-tech crimes unit. Detective Volkov was in his early 40s with a methodical way of asking questions that reminded me of Dennis Kwan, writing down every detail I provided and asking for clarification on technical terms. I brought printouts of Julian's forensic analysis, copies of Dennis's surveillance report, and screenshots of the calendar share access logs showing Rebecca had viewed my calendar hundreds of times over 7 months. Detective Volkov studied everything carefully and said this was clearly a case for both local police and federal authorities, that he'd coordinate with the FBI's Portland field office to get cybercrimes agents involved. He asked if I was willing to do a controlled confrontation with Rebecca, wearing a recording device and trying to get her to admit what she was doing, and my stomach dropped at the thought, but I said yes because I wanted this ended. The FBI agents arrived at the police bureau about an hour later, 2 special agents named Christopher Boyd and Nina Marquez, who specialized in cybercrime and corporate espionage. Agent Boyd was tall and spoke with precise technical language that suggested a background in computer science, while Agent Marquez had a more direct interviewing style that felt prosecutorial. They reviewed all the evidence I'd provided, asked detailed questions about DataShield's security architecture and client base, and wanted to know everything I could tell them about Rebecca's access to my systems. Agent Marquez asked if I'd ever discussed specific clients or projects with Rebecca, and I admitted I probably had in casual conversation, that 7 months of relationship dinners and phone calls meant I'd definitely mentioned work details I shouldn't have shared. Agent Boyd said they'd need to forensically image all of DataShield's servers to determine what, if anything, had been exfiltrated, and that we should prepare for the possibility that Rebecca had copied client data or proprietary code. The controlled confrontation was scheduled for Monday evening, giving the FBI team time over the weekend to prepare recording equipment and to develop a strategy for the conversation. Agent Marquez coached me on how to direct the conversation without being so obvious that Rebecca would realize she was being recorded, suggesting I should express doubts about our relationship and mention I felt like she knew too much about my life, creating an opening for her to explain herself or defend her actions. The goal was to get Rebecca to admit she'd accessed my devices or my accounts, to acknowledge she was working for someone, to provide any information about what she'd done with the data she'd collected. If we got her on recording admitting to even part of the operation, that would be enough to support federal charges. I spent that weekend in a strange suspended state, knowing that Monday would either confirm all my suspicions or prove I'd been catastrophically wrong about Rebecca. I practiced the conversation with Agent Marquez, trying to sound natural while hitting the key questions they needed answered, and every rehearsal made my chest tight with anxiety about how this would actually play out. Rebecca texted me Saturday asking if I wanted to come to Seattle for the weekend, and I made up an excuse about work deadlines, needing the space to prepare mentally for what was coming. She sent back a heart emoji and said she loved me, and I stared at that message for a long time, trying to figure out if she'd ever actually loved me, or if every word between us had been part of her operation. Monday came with clear skies and unusually warm May weather that felt wrong for what I was about to do. Agent Boyd met me at my apartment at 4 p.m. to install the recording equipment, a small wire that ran under my shirt and a backup audio recorder in my jacket pocket in case the wire failed. They'd set up a surveillance van across the street where Agents Boyd and Marquez would monitor the conversation in real time, and Detective Volkov would be there as well, since this was technically his case too. Rebecca was supposed to arrive at 6 p.m. for dinner, and I had 2 hours to clean my apartment and try to calm my racing heart and review the key questions I needed to work into our conversation. At 5:54 p.m., I got a text from Rebecca saying she was running a few minutes late, and I used those extra minutes to check that the recording equipment was working and to remind myself that this was necessary, that I needed the truth no matter how much it would hurt. Rebecca arrived at 6:12 p.m. with a bottle of wine and a smile that would have seemed genuine if I didn't know what I knew. She kissed me at the door, and I felt like I was kissing a stranger, someone whose face I recognized but whose identity was completely unknown to me. We sat on my couch with glasses of wine, and I started the conversation carefully, mentioning that I'd been feeling like our relationship had moved really fast, and that sometimes I felt like she knew me better than I knew her. Rebecca laughed and said that was sweet, that she felt the same way, that she'd never connected with someone the way she connected with me. I pushed a little harder, asking about her background and her family and her college roommate in Nashville, and I watched her face carefully as she answered, looking for any tells that she was lying. Rebecca's answers were smooth and well-rehearsed, mentioning a childhood in Northern California and parents who'd passed away in a car accident when she was in college, explaining why she didn't have much family she talked about. The Nashville roommate was named Jennifer. Rebecca had never mentioned a last name, and they'd lost touch over the years but had reconnected recently through social media. Everything sounded plausible, but I knew from Dennis's investigation that most of it was probably fabricated, that Rebecca was performing a character she'd created. I mentioned casually that I'd been thinking about security lately, that I'd heard about people having monitoring software on their phones and how invasive that was. And Rebecca agreed easily that privacy was important, that people should be careful about what they shared digitally. I changed tactics, mentioning that I'd noticed we seemed to run into each other in unexpected places sometimes, like Nashville, and wasn't that funny how life worked out? Rebecca's smile tightened slightly, a micro-expression that lasted maybe half a second, and she said coincidences happened more often than people thought, that the world was smaller than it seemed. I pressed further, asking if she'd ever accessed my calendar or my email to check my schedule, framing it as a reasonable thing that couples might do, and Rebecca's pause before answering told me everything. She said no, that she respected my privacy and wouldn't do something like that, but her voice had changed slightly, become more careful. I asked directly if she worked for Helix Strategic Solutions or if she knew anyone there, and Rebecca's face went completely blank for a moment before she asked where that question was coming from. I told her I'd done some research, that I'd found out about Helix and about her meetings there and about Garrett Finch and about the monitoring software that had been on my phone and laptop for 7 months. Rebecca stood up from the couch, her wine glass still in her hand, and I saw her calculating what to do next. She asked how I'd found out, and I said I had people who helped me, that I'd been documenting everything. Rebecca set down her wine glass very carefully and told me I didn't understand the situation, that it was more complicated than I thought, and I waited for her to explain, but instead she walked toward my door. I stood up and asked where she was going, and she said she needed to leave right now, that she couldn't talk about this. Agent Marquez's voice came through my earpiece telling me to keep her talking, to get her to admit something before she left, and I stepped between Rebecca and the door, asking her to please just explain what she'd been doing and why. Rebecca looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, and then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said I'd been a job, that Helix had been hired by SecureNet Systems to gather intelligence on DataShield's operations and client list, and that she'd been doing exactly what she was paid to do. She said she was sorry I'd figured it out before the project was complete, but that her work was done anyway, and SecureNet already had everything they needed. She pushed past me toward the door, and I heard shouting from outside as FBI agents came up the stairs. And Rebecca turned back to look at me one more time before Agent Boyd came through the door with his badge out and told her she was under federal arrest for computer fraud and corporate espionage. The next 4 hours were a blur of FBI agents processing my apartment as a crime scene, taking Rebecca into custody, and debriefing me on what I'd gotten recorded. Agent Marquez said Rebecca's admission that she'd been paid by SecureNet to gather intelligence was exactly what they needed. That combined with the forensic evidence of the monitoring software and the surveillance documentation, they had a solid case for federal prosecution. Rebecca had invoked her right to an attorney and wasn't saying anything else, but Agent Boyd said they'd already obtained search warrants for Helix Strategic Solutions and for SecureNet Systems, and they'd be executing those warrants first thing in the morning. The case was bigger now than just Rebecca. They were investigating a corporate espionage conspiracy that could involve dozens of people and multiple companies. Derek arrived at my apartment around 10 p.m. after I'd called him on the burner phone, and I had to brief him on everything that had happened while FBI forensic technicians were still photographing my laptop and phone. Derek looked shattered, realizing that our company's security had been completely compromised and that we were facing a massive disclosure obligation to clients and regulators. Victoria Lang, our lawyer, was already drafting notification letters and preparing for regulatory filings, and she'd scheduled an emergency meeting for first thing in the morning to discuss our response strategy. Derek asked if I was okay, and I honestly didn't know how to answer because I felt numb and violated and stupid for having trusted Rebecca for 7 months while she'd been systematically stealing from me. The FBI executed search warrants on Helix Strategic Solutions and SecureNet Systems at 6 a.m. the following morning, seizing servers and documents and computers and arresting 3 people, including the CEO of Helix. Agent Boyd called me at 8:15 a.m. to brief me on what they'd found. Extensive documentation of the intelligence operation against DataShield, including detailed reports Rebecca had filed on our security systems and client list, copies of emails and documents she'd extracted from my laptop, and communications showing SecureNet had paid Helix $280,000 for the operation. They'd also found evidence of similar operations Helix had run against other companies, suggesting this was a pattern of criminal behavior rather than an isolated incident. The FBI was coordinating with the Securities and Exchange Commission because SecureNet was publicly traded, and this kind of illegal intelligence gathering could constitute securities fraud if it had been used to manipulate market position. The media coverage started that afternoon when the FBI issued a press release about the arrests, and by evening, DataShield was being contacted by journalists asking for comment on the corporate espionage case. Victoria Lang handled all media inquiries with a carefully crafted statement emphasizing that we were victims of criminal activity and that we were cooperating fully with law enforcement, but the damage to our reputation was immediate. 2 clients called to express concern about whether their data had been compromised, and we had to schedule emergency meetings to walk them through our response and our security improvements. Derek and I spent the entire week doing nothing but damage control, meeting with clients, briefing our board of directors, and implementing new security protocols to prevent anything like this from happening again. The criminal case moved forward quickly because the evidence was so clear. Rebecca was charged with computer fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy, and she was held without bail given her history of using false identities and her obvious flight risk. Garrett Finch was arrested a week later when he tried to board an international flight using a fake passport, and he was charged as a co-conspirator in the Helix operation. The CEO of Helix, a man named Douglas Winters, was charged with running a criminal enterprise and faced the most serious penalties because the FBI had evidence of multiple similar operations his company had conducted. SecureNet's CEO and their head of competitive intelligence were both arrested and charged with conspiracy, and SecureNet's stock price collapsed as investors realized the company had been engaging in illegal tactics. The civil litigation started almost immediately after the criminal charges were filed. Victoria Lang filed a lawsuit on behalf of DataShield against SecureNet, Helix, Rebecca, and everyone else involved in the conspiracy, seeking damages for theft of trade secrets, tortious interference with business relationships, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We were seeking $50 million in damages based on calculations of lost business value and the cost of the security remediation we'd had to implement. SecureNet's lawyers tried to argue their executives had acted without board knowledge, but the FBI's evidence showed otherwise, showing that the intelligence operation had been discussed at the highest levels of the company. 3 of SecureNet's major clients terminated their contracts when the criminal charges became public, and industry analysts were predicting the company would have to file for bankruptcy within 6 months. The personal toll of the whole situation was harder to quantify than the business impact. I spent weeks replaying every interaction I'd had with Rebecca, every conversation and dinner and moment of intimacy, wondering what had been genuine and what had been performance. My therapist, Dr. Amy Sterling, specialized in treating victims of fraud and betrayal, and she helped me process the grief of losing a relationship that had never actually existed the way I'd thought it did. I felt stupid for not seeing the signs earlier, for letting Rebecca into my life so completely without ever really questioning who she was. Dr. Sterling kept reminding me that sophisticated con artists and intelligence operatives were trained to be convincing, that my trust wasn't foolishness, but normal human behavior, and that I shouldn't blame myself for being targeted by criminals who'd spent their careers perfecting deception. The trial took place 8 months after Rebecca's arrest, in federal court in Portland, with Judge Raymond Fletcher presiding. The prosecution presented a methodical case showing exactly how the conspiracy had worked. SecureNet had hired Helix to gather intelligence on their competitors. Helix had assigned Rebecca to target me specifically because of my access to Data Shield systems. Rebecca had created a false identity and engineered our meeting at that networking event, and then she'd spent 7 months building trust while installing monitoring software and exfiltrating data. The FBI's forensic evidence showed Rebecca had copied over 40,000 files from my laptop, including client contracts, proprietary code, internal communications, and security architecture documents. All of that information had been passed to Helix and then to SecureNet, giving them detailed knowledge of our business operations that they'd use to undercut our pricing and poach our clients. Rebecca's defense attorney tried to argue she'd been manipulated by Helix and hadn't understood the full scope of what she was involved in, but the prosecution destroyed that narrative by showing emails where Rebecca had explicitly discussed specific data she was targeting and had asked for bonus payments when she successfully obtained particularly valuable information. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Rebecca was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $4.2 million in restitution. Douglas Winters got 12 years and Helix was dissolved as part of his plea agreement. SecureNet's CEO got 10 years and SecureNet itself was sold to a competitor after declaring bankruptcy, with the proceeds going to settle the civil litigation. A year after Rebecca's arrest, I was sitting in Data Shield's conference room with Derek and our board, reviewing the annual results and discussing the path forward. We'd survived the espionage incident, though it had been close. We'd lost 3 major clients and had spent over $2 million on security improvements and legal fees. But we'd also gained 6 new clients who'd been impressed by how we'd handled the crisis and by the enhanced security protocols we'd implemented afterward. The FBI had referred several other companies to us after seeing our response, and we'd become known in the industry as the firm that had successfully defended against sophisticated corporate espionage. Derek joked that Rebecca had accidentally given us the best marketing campaign we could have asked for, and I laughed even though it still hurt to think about what she'd done. I'd started dating again, cautiously, with much more careful vetting of anyone new I met. I'd learned to recognize red flags I'd missed with Rebecca, to trust my instincts when something felt off, to verify rather than just accept what people told me about themselves. My therapist said that was healthy skepticism rather than paranoia, that using past experience to inform future decisions was exactly what growth looked like. I'd also reconciled with my ex-wife Lauren, not romantically but as friends, and I'd apologized for the workaholism that had destroyed our marriage. She'd told me that watching me deal with the Rebecca situation had shown her I'd grown, that I was more aware now of my own vulnerabilities and more willing to ask for help, and that meant a lot coming from someone who'd known me at my worst. The last hearing in the case happened on a Friday afternoon in November, a restitution proceeding where the judge finalized how much each defendant owed and established payment plans. I attended even though I didn't have to, wanting to see this through to its conclusion. Rebecca was brought in from federal prison, and she looked different, thinner, harder, older somehow, even though only a year had passed. Her attorney made a statement about how she'd used her time in prison to reflect on her actions and to pursue education in coding and technology, hoping to work in legitimate tech fields when she was eventually released. The judge was unmoved, emphasizing that Rebecca had shown sophisticated planning and zero remorse during the trial, and that her victims deserved full restitution even if it took decades to collect. Rebecca was led back out of the courtroom, and she didn't look at me as she passed, which felt right somehow. There was nothing left between us to acknowledge. I left the courthouse that day and drove to the hiking trail where Derek and I had first discussed the surveillance, the place where I decided to investigate rather than confront. The trail looked different in November. Wet leaves, gray skies, that particular Pacific Northwest gloom that usually matched my mood, but today felt almost comforting. I walked the same path Derek and I had walked a year ago, thinking about everything that had happened since then, and I realized I felt something like peace. Not happiness exactly, not the absence of pain, but a sense that I'd survived something terrible and had come out intact. Rebecca had tried to destroy everything I'd built, and she'd failed. Data Shield was stronger than before. I was more careful and more aware. The justice system had actually worked. That had to count for something. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek asking if I wanted to grab dinner, and I realized with some surprise that yes, I did, that I was ready to be around people again without constantly analyzing their motives. I texted back that I'd meet him at our usual spot, a Vietnamese place near the office where we'd been going for years and where the owner knew our order by heart. Normal life, continuing despite everything. I started back toward the parking lot, and I thought about that first coincidence in the Nashville airport, Rebecca ordering my exact drink before I'd even noticed she was there. I'd known something was wrong in that moment, felt it in my gut, and I'd been right. The scariest part wasn't that she'd been surveilling me for months. It was that part of me had known all along, and I'd chosen to ignore it because I wanted the relationship to be real. I wouldn't make that mistake again. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.